There's been a lot of talk about how money is now being circulated in campaigns, both by the campaigns themselves and by outside groups. There's some concern that this isn't transparent enough. As the Secretary of State, how have you worked to change that, if you have, and what would that mean as governor?
Well, you say that the Secretary of State is in charge of this. I think that's a little stretch in the sense that the Secretary does not adopt any laws. We have to comply with and operate under the statutes that are adopted by the legislature, and I have pushed for legislation to open the transparency of our elections. You know, they say in real estate that the three most important things are location, location, and location. In elections, I think it's disclosure, disclosure, and disclosure. And I would support and have pushed for bills in the legislature to open up the disclosure so that anyone, corporate, otherwise, political action committees, the dark money, if you want to try to influence an election in Arizona, you should disclose where that money's coming from so that the people know what the incentives are, perhaps, or the motivations behind where those dollars are coming from. But I don't get to write those rules and regulations, but I'd like to see, and as governor, I will push for more openness and transparency so that the dark money, which is beginning to overtake the elections. There's almost more money, unless you're very, very wealthy or raise huge amounts of money. More money will probably be spent by outside forces in Arizona elections than within the candidates' campaigns. And that's, I don't think, good for Arizona.
Some have said that that actually discourages voter turnout. It discourages voters from knowing their candidates, and voter turnout, particularly in primaries, is down in the 20% level. Do you have any thoughts about how to increase that?
Well, one of the things that I think we need to do within our campaigns is do as little attacking of other candidates as possible. And I am pleased in the Republican primary that I think I'm the one of the, maybe Frank as well, that has not run ads or had groups on our behalf running ads tearing down other candidates in the race. I've never campaigned in that way and never will. I don't think we should have to tear down someone else in order to build ourselves up. And so the monies that I've spent, we're talking about me, and that's the way I'm going to keep it. I think people get discouraged when they see such negative campaigning, even within their own parties, and it probably does discourage voter turnout when they see such negative things said about people within their own party.
We have here in this region at least many small towns, and they have set their own election cycles, and yet the state legislature has decided it's a state interest to actually control when we vote. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I would not have supported that had I been in the legislature or been the governor signing that bill. It was the Consolidated Elections Bill. I think it violated the appropriate local control that should exist at the local level. Its goals were to try to get the elections to be on one of 4 days each year, thinking that if we had all the elections together, we would have more turnout for all of those elections. I think what we're going to find is that it almost backfires when the ballots get so long that voters drop off when they get to the more localized elections. So we'll see, but I would not have supported that bill had I been in the legislature or signed it as governor. I am very much a local control person. One of the things that I talk about is that experience matters. And part of that is private business experience. I've been in business for 30 years with a couple of companies, our family business in Prescott and now with a cancer hospital down in the Phoenix area. But the other, in 25 of those same 30 years, I've also served in local government. I started out on the Prescott City Council. That gave me a very good foundation when I would later find myself in the legislature, because I can remember as a young councilman having a training session by the director of the Arizona League of Cities and Towns. His name was Jack Dabalski, and he came up and gave us the theory of government. Jack's theory of government was that every level of government is always complaining about the ones above them, giving them unfunded mandates and telling them what to do, and then for some reason, a lot of them turn right around and do the same things to the ones below them. And I promised myself as a new council person that even though I wasn't planning on a legislative or political career, that if I ever had that opportunity, I would break that cycle. And when I got to the state Senate, and especially when I was president of the state Senate, We restored the HERF sweeps of the monies that local governments were having withheld from them by the state legislature to try to balance the legislature's budget. I do not believe that the state should balance its budget on the backs of local communities. And if I get to be the next governor, we won't phase those monies back into you gradually. We will restore them on day one, because local governments need every dollar that was promised to them decades ago when we made agreements between the state and the local communities that they would receive a portion of their monies that we collect at the state level.
That brings up the education funding. During the recession, the state budget may not have been balanced on the backs of education, but it was certainly cut significantly.
Yes.
The second tax that was proposed would have funneled $700 million, I believe, in the extension of the sales tax per year to schools, and I believe you oppose that. Can you talk about increasing education funding, or are there other ways that you're looking to increase student achievement?
Well, throughout the campaign, I have talked about my record in the legislature, and I think it's important to know what a person is going to do going forward based on their actual record in the state legislative process. During the 4 years that I was Senate President, we put more new money into the K-12 school system than any other 4-year period in the history of the state. Now, the Arizona Republic just did a fact check on me. They've been asking our campaign for proof of that for the last week or so, and I'm glad to announce that I think in the next day or two they will release their findings that, in fact, during the 4 years I was Senate President, we put more new money. I was talking about $640 million that we did in just a couple years as Senate President. When we actually look back to the 4 years, K-12 funding during my 4 years as Senate President grew by almost $1.2 billion during that 4 years. Now, at the same time, we also cut taxes by $500 million a year. At the same time, we fully funded health care and children's services. At the same time, we put more new money into higher education than any other 4-year period in the history of the state. And yet, we also did that and left over $1.1 billion in the state's rainy day fund and other reserve funds. So getting more money to education is not something that I am theoretical about. It's something that I've proven I will and can do. Now, I opposed the extension of the 1-cent sales tax because one of the problems I think we have in state government is we have a tax system that is structured so that it skyrockets. The money coming into state government skyrockets during good economic times and then collapses during down economic times. When I left the state Senate, we were collecting $9.5 billion a year into the state's general fund, and we were spending $9.5 billion. And we had, as I said, $1.1 billion in the state's rainy day fund. In 2008, 2009, and 2010, the Arizona economy, we usually measure it by GDP, gross domestic product, the Arizona economy over that 3-year economic downturn constricted or went down by about 10% during 2008, 2009, and 10. And yet the revenue coming from the state's revenue system into the state's general fund dropped by almost a third. It went from the $9.5 billion to $6.5 billion. We need to restructure our tax system so that the revenue coming into state government flows with the economy. If there's a 10% downturn in the economy of Arizona, the revenue coming to the state should probably dip by about 10%. And the state should have to tighten its belt like everybody else does. As it turned out, because we have sales taxes on high-dollar ticket items, new homes, new cars, and we have the income tax, which relies very heavily on capital gains and other things. The $9.5 billion coming in from our tax system dropped to $6.5. We had to do temporary tax increases. I did not support the extension because I didn't want to extend or compound a tax system that has this type of an effect. We need to restructure the tax system. I actually would support Barry's, it's not Barry's idea, but I would agree with him that we need to be the 10th state to eliminate the state income tax. and replace it with a low-rate, broad-based consumption tax, still collect the same amount of money, but collect it as people spend, and therefore our tax burden is directly proportional to our standard of living. Now, there's two principles. One is I'm not trying to raise or lower the total amount that we're collecting, just collect it in a different way. The second is I would not support shifting the tax burden from one group to another, but you can correct that or take care of that by which transactions you collect at that low rate consumption tax. You could actually have a consumption tax lower than the 5.6% sales tax that we have, and if you applied it on about 2/3 of the transactions in the economy, so that still allows the exemption of maybe food or health, medication or healthcare or some services or education, you could still exclude a substantial portion of transactions in the economy from that consumption tax, but you would collect a tax that flows with the economy instead of spiking up in the good years and collapsing in the bad years. So I oppose that because I didn't want to compound our cyclical tax system any more than we have to.
On the healthcare compromise that was reached by the hospitals and the governor in taking, I think, a patient fee and again leveraging federal dollars, that was something that I think had some pretty broad-based support, and you oppose that. How does that work?
I oppose the way that it was done. I think it required a 2/3 vote. The voters several years ago passed an initiative that said anything that is done that raises revenues into the state's general fund should be done with a 2/3 vote in the legislature. I did not support the way the governor did by running over her own party leadership in the legislature. When I was Senate President, we had small majorities, very narrow majorities in the state Senate. One year it was 17 Republicans, 13 Democrats. The other year it was 16-14. I passed 4 balanced budgets. We passed 4 balanced budgets. But it wasn't just with getting only the Republican votes and a couple of Democrats or vice versa. I met every week with the leaders of both the Democrats and the Republicans in the Senate. And instead of going after the magic 16 votes in order to get something through the Senate, we focused on doing what was the right thing for Arizona, and in so doing, we attracted majorities of the Republican caucus and the Democrat caucus, and the budgets that we passed during my 4 years as Senate President, we passed with 24, 25, 26 votes out of the 30 senators because we put away some of the partisan bickering, identified some win-win solutions, and made progress for Arizona beyond the typical political haggling. So I disagreed with the way that the expansion was done, and frankly, I don't think it's sustainable to continue to rely on more and more federal dollars to make our healthcare system work in Arizona. I've identified what I call the 5-5-5 plan, reduce by 5% our participants in access or Medicaid by growing the economy and getting them into jobs where they and their employer can afford their health care instead of the taxpayers. The second 5% would be moving 5% of our access enrollees into a pilot program using health savings accounts where the individuals have a little more skin in the game, if you might say, using a health savings account model. And then the third would be reduce the number of people on access by eliminating fraud, waste, abuse, and doing drug testing. So the only sustainable model, I think, going forward, either statewide or nationally, is to get more people in position to afford their own health care instead of growing the number of people who depend on the rest of the taxpayers to pay for theirs.
We have one more minute. One of the things that has been found in some of the ACA signups has been young people have been signing up for insurance, and it raises a question of how Arizona can keep and can attract this younger group in an economy that frankly needs them. It needs their talent. It needs some of their creativity. Do you have some thoughts about going beyond business as usual to look at that group?
Well, I think engaging the young talent in Arizona is very critical. It was one of the goals identified in the Arizona We Want. I think what young people are looking for is leaders who can bring people together, get over the partisan bickering, quit poking each other in the eye because they're of a different party. And as I said, I think we proved during 4 years of my Senate presidency that we could bring people together. And yes, we cut taxes and we balanced budgets and we left $1 billion in the rainy day fund, but we put more new money into education and health care and higher education. And that's what I think young people are looking for, is solutions, not partisan bickering.